Dr. Martin Luther King was an American preacher, humanitarian, and activist. He is best known for his role in the African American Civil Rights Movement. He was inspired by his faith in Gandhi. He used the power of his words along with protests, sit-ins, and boycotts to achieve equality for all people. Martin Luther King was born January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. He attended Booker T. Washington High, where he skipped the 9th and 12th grade, and enrolled in Morehouse College at the age of 15. In his final semester at Morehouse College, he was ordained as a minister. His first steps to becoming an activist were writing a letter to the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, declaring all African Americans were entitled to the basic rights and opportunities of American citizens. Later began his doctoral studies at Boston University. Here he started using his education and his faith to form his foundation for what would become his crucial role in the civil rights movement. While in Boston, Martin met and dated Coretta Scott, who he would later marry and have 4 kids with.
The day that we started a bus protest which literally electrified the nation.
On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama, for refusing to give her seat up to a white person. Later that day, Martin and other activists met up and planned out a citywide protest, which would later become known as the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which would last over 380 days. Martin was arrested and harassed by the people who didn't like the changes that he stood for. The bus boycott, however, was a success. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled racial segregation in transportation as unconstitutional. After the boycott victory, civil rights leaders saw a need for a national organization to better organize their efforts. In January of 1957, Martin, as well as other ministers and activists, founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also known as the SCLC. With Martin as the president, he helped coordinate nonviolent protests throughout the South. A primary focus of the SCLC was to register African Americans to vote. In 1963, Martin led a coalition of several civil rights groups and a nonviolent campaign focused on Birmingham, Alabama, due to it being called one of the most segregated cities in America. During these demonstrations, African Americans were being attacked by police dogs and high-pressure fire hoses. This was being displayed across the nation on TVs, newspapers, and magazines. This was the time that Martin wrote "Letter from a Birmingham Jail" after he was arrested for his participation in these demonstrations. In 1963, Martin became one of the driving forces behind the March for Jobs and Freedom, also known as the March on Washington. On August 28, 1963, over 250,000 people of all races gathered in Washington, D.C. to demand justice and equality for all people. This is when Martin delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech.
That one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners, will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood? I have a dream.
In 1964, at the age of 35, Martin received the Nobel Peace Prize. He promised to donate the prize money to continue the important work of the civil rights movement. As well as in 1964, Martin's "I Have a Dream" speech pushed Congress to pass the landmark Civil Rights Act, making it illegal to discriminate against people due to their race. The Jim Crow laws of the South that promoted segregation and mistreatment towards African Americans were now against the federal law. In March of 1965, Martin led a march from Selma to the Capitol building in Montgomery, Alabama, to push President Lyndon B. Johnson and his administration to pass a law protecting the voting rights of African American voters. While marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, marchers were confronted violently by law enforcement. This day became known as Bloody Sunday. The marchers were able to prevail through all that was thrown at them. They made it to the Capitol in Montgomery, where Martin would give another inspirational speech.
Those who said that we would get here only over their dead bodies. Well, talk. All the world today knows that we are here and we are standing before the forces of power in the state of Alabama, saying we ain't gonna let nobody turn us around.
Later that year, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act that eliminated the remaining barriers to voting for African Americans. Prior to this act, there were still areas in the country that weren't allowing African Americans to vote. In the next 3 years, Martin started focusing on economic injustice and international peace. Martin and the SCLC also put together the Poor People's Campaign in 1968 in an effort to create a multiracial group of lower-income Americans who would aim for economic change. On April 4, 1968, Martin was shot while standing outside on his hotel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee, at the age of 39. Martin was buried in his hometown of Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Martin Luther King worked hard to make sure all people, no matter their ethnicity or religion, had equal opportunities and didn't have to live fearing violence or discrimination. A memorial was made in honor of Martin Luther King, which is located in Washington, D.C. There are quotes from his speeches, sermons, and writings surrounding the large statue of MLK.